Today we're going to be talking about integers. So first off, what is an integer? Here we have examples of things that are integers and things that are not. So when I'm looking here, I see negative values, I see positive values, I see the number 0. Over here, I also see negatives and positives. The difference is, on the integer side, I don't see any decimals or fractions. Not integers, I do see decimal and fraction values. So, what integers are? They are all positive and negative counting numbers. So what I mean is, if I asked you to count to 10, you would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You would not say 0.75, 1, 1 2/3, 1.98, 2, 2.1. That doesn't make sense. So our counting numbers, the positive as well as the negative, so -1, -2, -3, and so on. So it does not include decimals or fractions. Okay. When we're looking at number lines, so number lines are a line with numbers marked at equal intervals. So real life applications of that: thermometers, football fields, rulers. They have numbers marked at equal intervals on them. When we are looking at a number line here, okay, our negative numbers are as we go to the left. Our positive numbers are as we go to the right, okay? And it works opposite. So remembering, we're kind of working backwards. If I start from 0, I'm going -1, -2, -3 towards the left. For negatives, positives, I'm going 1, 2, 3 to the right, okay? So let's plot the following numbers. Number 1, we've got plot 9 on the horizontal number line. So here it is already listed for us, but if it's positive, I know it's going to be to the right of 0. So it's going to be at +9 to the right. For number 2, plot -8 on the number line. And if I think about that, I can remember my negatives are to the left. And if you want to highlight to help you the negative side versus the positive side, then do that. So -8 is right here. When I'm plotting it directly on the line, not above it, not below it, right on the line at -8. All right, number 3, plot -13 on the horizontal number line. So here, we only have some of the numbers listed. So remember, we go to the left when we're counting with negative. So I'm just gonna start at -10, and I'm gonna write, it will be, keep getting smaller. So -11, -12, -13. So -13 goes right here, which makes sense. If I kept counting -14, that would land at -15. Okay, same thing for -17. I'm going to count. And I could start at -10 and still do -11, -12, -13, -14. That brings me to -15, -16, -17. And if I kept counting, it would work. -18, -19, -20. Now let's look at some vertical number line examples. So that's just going up and down. So in this case, our positives are as we go up, and our negatives are as we go down. So plotting -2 on the vertical number line, I find 0. I'm going down for negative. So going down -1, -2. For number 6, plotting 3, that is a positive value. That means I'm going up. So from 0, I'm going up 1, 2, 3. Okay, now we're going to be looking at a number line and identifying the integer that is plotted on that number line. So right here, we're between negative 15 and negative 20. So I can start at negative 15. I'm going to label these numbers. And remember, as I'm going to the left, my numbers are getting smaller. So negative 16, negative 17, should be at negative 18. Let me just double check. Negative 19, negative 20, that works. So our dot is at negative 18. If you accidentally counted negative 14, negative 13, negative 12, negative 11, that would have to be negative 10. That wouldn't make sense. Okay, looking at our vertical number line, which integer is plotted? So remember, as we go down, it gets further into the negative. So if I'm starting at negative 35 and I'm going down, this should be at negative 36. Let's just double check. Negative 37, negative 38, negative 39, and that would bring us to negative 40. So that dot is at negative 36. So let's talk about opposites for a minute. Opposites are two numbers that are the same distance from 0 on a number line, but on the opposite sides of 0. So, for example, negative 4 and 4 are opposites because 4 is 4 to the right, and negative 4 is 4 to the left, okay? Or 6 and negative 6 are opposites because 6 is 6 to the right, negative 6 is 6 to the left. So, plotting opposites says the integer 7 is marked on the following number line. Plot the opposite of 7. Well, the opposite of 7 would be negative 7. Number 10, negative 6 is marked on the number line. Well, the opposite of a negative is a positive, so the opposite of negative 6 is going to be positive 6. Then here, when it's asking the opposite value of 0, a lot of people want to say negative 0 because we think, well, the opposite of a positive is a negative. That is not right. 0 is kind of its own special case scenario where the opposite of 0 is just 0. There's no positive, there's no negative. All right, then last part, and this is going to be important, especially when you get into adding and subtracting integers. A negative sign also means opposite. So negative is the same kind of idea as opposite, right? Negative 6 is the opposite of positive 6. So for number 12, it says, what does looks like two negative signs 8 mean? But we're going to identify each negative as opposite. So we have our negative sign here. That means the opposite. So all of these have the opposite, except for the negative of 8. That doesn't really make sense. We're not going to include that. And then this second part here is negative 8, which really just means the opposite of 8. So I'm looking for where I see the opposite again. So we have this one just has the opposite of 8. That doesn't make sense because that's only referring to one negative. The next one says the opposite of 8. That fits the description. And this third one, it has the opposite of, but there's this extra opposite. So the one that works is B. It is the opposite of 8. And what does that mean? Well, what's the opposite of negative 8? The opposite of negative 8 is positive 8. All right. Number 13. What does negative 25 mean? So, again, thinking of negatives as opposite. So first I'm going to look at where do I see the opposite written. So the opposite, the opposite, the opposite. Then we have another opposite, right? So That first one, it just said negative. That doesn't apply. This second one, there's not a second opposite. That doesn't work. This one has the opposite, and this one has the opposite. So we have the opposite of, and now we just need 25. So it's going to be D. That is the opposite of 25, not this extra opposite. And then what is the opposite of negative 25? Well, the opposite of a negative is a positive. So those negatives cancel each other out. Number 14, what does negative 12 mean? So again, let's look at our opposites. We have a negative sign, which is going to mean the opposite, the opposite, the opposite. This negative 12 doesn't match. Then we have a second negative, which also is the opposite. So I see the opposite, I see the opposite. There's not another opposite for D, so that doesn't work. And then we just have 12, so it's the opposite of 12, which we see in part A. Part B has an extra opposite. So the opposite of 12. And what is the opposite of 12, or the opposite of negative 12 is going to be positive 12. All right, last one. What does negative 3 mean? Well, let's highlight our first negative or opposite sign. So the opposite, the opposite, the opposite. This negative does not apply. Let's highlight our next negative, which again means the opposite, the opposite. Part B doesn't have another opposite, so that doesn't work. So we have the opposite of 3. That one works. For C, it has the opposite of, and there's an extra opposite, so that does not work. And what is the value of that? What is the opposite of negative 3? The opposite of a negative is a positive.